I think for most people, when they first become interested in Yiquan, they become interested in a rumour. And it's a rumour about the values, practices, culture of traditional Chinese wushu, which we love, but also combined with practical fight outcomes, which, being completely honest, we're very often disappointed with in Chinese physical culture. So this rumour is very intriguing. It seems to combine this thing that we love with this thing that we're really looking for. Unfortunately, it's in the nature of rumours that they tend to remain very vague, and that's a positive and a negative thing. It leaves lots of space for exploration, for growth. It doesn't require lots of detailed information at first just to get people interested in the idea. But it also leaves a lot of space for misunderstanding. And unfortunately, that misunderstanding very often then carries on even when people begin learning Yiquan. And I think this is something that was recognised very early on, that if you want to have an exciting new way of thinking about it, not that it really was new, I suppose, lots of martial arts in China were based around this idea that your physical training was also an exploration of other things. But if you want to have this exciting way of training where it's quite open-ended and it's creative, and also it's built up in stages so you can't just understand things straight away, then you need some kind of concrete goals, something that people can understand and something that helps structure the system itself all the way through so that people don't get lost. For this reason, Yiquan has 3 core intended learning outcomes, and these are health, practical martial arts ability, and intellectual development. And these are they're the 3 trees that grow together and they support and nourish one another's development, and through that they form the base of Yiquan practice. Wang Shangjai talks about each of these aspects of Yiquan multiple times, but as far as I'm aware, it's Yao Zongzun who first specifically identifies and writes about them as the 3 core intended learning outcomes. Thinking about health first, health is obviously important, but this importance takes on a different significance when it's interlinked with the other 2 core aspects. And remember, their development is mutually interdependent. So the process of cultivation, that is, of learning to roll back what Wang Shangjai calls the social forces that repress our natural or innate potential, takes a very long time. It's not something that you can just learn from someone else, obviously, because it's your natural ability, not someone else's. This is something you have to unfold, and that's a key word that we use to get across that each one is very different to a system where you just follow someone else and learn what they teach as if you're having property passed on to you. It takes a long time to unfold your potential, and I don't think that's a process that ever really ends, and it goes through many phases. So you need to remain as healthy as possible and as capable of doing serious training as possible for as long as possible. You need to stay in shape. You need to keep eating well. Watch what you drink if you do drink. It's a long-term task. But it's not just about physical development. Development in each one is closely connected to your development as a person, and I don't mean that in these pseudo-spiritual terms. I mean your intellectual development, your insight, your understanding of what you're doing and why. Physical and intellectual development are intertwined. They feed each other. Wang Shangjai tells us this directly himself. But it really should be obvious that being able to do something and understanding how you do it are both equally important. In Yiquan, No one really understands anything much beyond what they can actually do or their highest previous level of achievements. But it also works the other way in that understanding things changes the way that you train. And because it does take a long time to develop and mature as a person, well, that process is also very long term. For it to take place, you need to be training diligently, and you also need to be engaging conceptually over a long period. I'm making that sound like a chore, but as Yao Zongzun says, that's really the great joy of Yiquan. It's not something you can just learn from someone else and then you have it. It's a journey of personal exploration, personal, growth, if you want to use that word. Training in a healthy manner is also obviously very important in Yiquan. This is something that Wang Xiangjai emphasizes right from the start, and this is connected to both the aspects that we've just discussed, intellectual and physical cultivation over a long period. To be able to continue training, you need to use your body in the smartest way, not wearing it out. Remember what Bruce Lee said, that you need to train smarter, not harder. So it's quite common to hear people say, don't think about it, just do hundreds of repetitions, just do tons of hard training. And Yao Zongzun particularly criticises this idea and says people fetishise mindless hard work without thinking. But in Yiquan, it's quality that matters more than quantity all the way through the training process. So we know right at the start, of course, you do more quantity. It's a process of narrowing it down from kind of gross training to refined training. But even right at the start, we should already be thinking about repetition as a process of intuitive improvement. Of course, every martial art does that. But sometimes people think that the way to do this is just to fully exert yourself over multiple repetitions, and somehow this will cause the body to intuitively form into the correct movement. A good example of this is hitting the punch bag. A lot of people think that the way to train on a punch bag is get on it and just hit it as hard as you possibly can, multiple times. Somehow the body will just eventually form itself into the correct method of hitting. Yao Zongzun's student Sui Ruibin mentions that when Yao Zongzun was talking to Western boxing coaches during a conference of some kind, they were astonished at the idea that hitting a bag lightly could have tremendous benefits. But that method is simple, really. If you hit a bag as hard as you can, you completely overwhelm your body's ability to register the subtleties of the movement. And sure, you can get powerful, but with light bag hitting, you can get better technique. Your body can feel the movement and gradually sense where the technique is right or wrong. Being diligent in this sort of practice, which is not easy, people enjoy hitting the bag. There's lots of reasons for that. It gets some stress out and it makes you feel good. And it's the most impressive way of using the bag. But being diligent, carefully, step by step, training, building, you can gradually sense where the technique is going right. You can gradually sense where it's wrong, and you can make enormous strides in technical improvement and actually improve faster than just hitting the bag full power. And of course, one of the enormous benefits of this is that you don't cause unnecessary wear and tear. And from there, you can gradually increase power, checking at every stage that you're maintaining correct form. And this is a great example of how technical development and health go hand in hand. It's also a great example of how a concept can revolutionise the way that you train. In terms of martial arts ability, this is one of the most difficult outcomes, and of course it's the paramount outcome because there's no point in Yiquan without this. You can be healthy and you can have an intellectual understanding of martial arts, but if there's no practical ability, then there's no Yiquan, and that should be obvious. But certainly at the time when I'm living, widespread failure in terms of this learning outcome is probably the biggest problem of all in Yiquan and Chinese martial arts generally. As I said, that's very often why people become interested in Yiquan in the first place, because they think it's overcome that problem. This isn't just a failure of practical ability, it's a failure, a malicious and deliberate failure in many cases, of understanding. That is, people actively lie to make it seem as if this learning outcome doesn't matter. I'll come back to the reasons for this another time, but for now we can just say that each one is about finding or understanding the real. If that isn't the overall goal, then your cultivation is perverted off course. And for those who know about Wang Shanzhai's thinking, you'll know that he was very influenced by Buddhist thinking, and we don't have to be Buddhist to understand the way that he perceives this. So we can use the Buddhist idea of dependent arising, which is an idea that in modern terms is something like a complex holistic view of reality where no thing exists independently and the development of all things is mutually interactive. So if one piece of the Yiquan development process is corrupt, then everything is corrupted, and what arises is corrupted. That's why we have these three trees that grow together, that are nourished together, and that mutually nourish one another's growth. So you have to have understanding the real as the end goal to ensure that every part of your training is structured in the image of this consideration. And the real, in this case, is the reality of the context of the fight. It's quite common now for people to say that each one is about spiritual development, and that's a perversion, and it corrupts everything else. And I mean literally, I can think of several each one groups that are literally exploitative new religious movements, as sociologists call them, or cults, as they are more commonly called. There's no reality where self-deceit and lying about yourself is spiritual. And let's be honest, when people talk about spirituality, what they usually mean is that they want to wear the robe of being a martial artist. They want to role play being a martial artist and use that as some kind of vehicle of pretense. And that's very different to, for example, Wang Shanzhai's idea of each one being a genuine medium of self-insight, which you can call that spiritual if you like. And I also think that when people use this idea of spirituality to avoid real training, they confuse the idea of self-development, which is a goal, cultivation. Remember, in each one, that's intellectual cultivation. It doesn't exclude the idea of spiritual cultivation, if you want to use that idea. Wang Shanzhai is very influenced by Buddhist thinking, for example. But understanding the real and not confusing the vehicle, which is practical fight training, as a genuine, honest medium of insight into who you are. That's the core of each one, not an abstract idea that leads you astray. So in any case, the most important thing to understand about this learning outcome, i.e. practical martial arts ability, is that you have to want to practice in a fight-oriented manner. You can't develop unless your path is contextualized by the reality of fight training. You must want the truth of that, no matter the precious expectations which that might disappoint. And believe me, if you're holding on to ideas of some kind of magical spiritual powers, that will be soundly disappointed. In fact, in most cases, even the most basic hopes of finding something that adheres to the quintessence principles of Wushu, but is nevertheless practical, isn't embarrassing, that can stand strong in the world of martial arts, even that expectation, that most fundamental and basic expectation, will be disappointed. Which is not to say that there isn't something real here. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe that there was. So, understanding all of this conceptually can radically improve your level. It's often quite difficult to narrow down what truth is in martial arts, but it's relatively easy to cut away nonsense. And in a way, that can be a kind of training in itself. Now, of course, I know that there are people who say that you don't need to think in each one. You just need to train and you will eventually get it. In all cases that I've seen of people who say that, they can neither demonstrate or explain what it is that they've apparently got. Moreover, Wang Xiangjia himself doesn't agree with them. He says that your intellectual development is just as critical as your physical training. Yao Zhongzun similarly says that you must engage in the intellectual process to advance. If you don't believe this, and you can't get over that way of thinking, which is, by the way, a concept, stop listening. I haven't got enough time left in this world to engage in convincing anyone of anything, let alone the obvious basics. I'm just working on the assumption that if you're listening to me, then you're conceptually engaged. As well as being important for your own development, conceptual understanding has another very important role in Yiquan. Wang Xiangjia draws many elements from Buddhism, and one is the role played by Dharma. In Buddhism, we can say, in simple terms, this means knowledge or practices of Buddhism, the theory of Buddhism, if you like. This is an idea that, in a lesser form, can be applied to lots of things, like science or other academic fields. By having a field of knowledge, people can work together to progress faster. When you have what we might call a Dharma of each one, i.e. a shared understanding, then progress can be made towards enlightenment. And here Wang uses precisely the same concept as in Mahayana Buddhism, that is, that enlightenment itself is a form of knowledge. And indeed, he views these processes as related. I'll come back to this another time, but there's an idea in Buddhism that enlightenment is a group project, and this is very much how Wang Xiangjia sees each one, that by having conceptual understandings, we have a language that we can communicate with one another through, that we can create a kind of dharma, and from that we can help everyone to progress. It's not just an individual practice. So that's the three intended learning outcomes in each one.